Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Themes and Styles Demystified. I'm Alan Viverette. I'm a tech lead on the UI Toolkit team and the engineer responsible for the material themes.
Hi, I'm Chris Baines, an engineer on the developer relations team. I also work on app compat, so I deal with themes and styles quite a lot. So it's great to see so many faces in front of me, especially sunburnt ones, because it's been hot here in Mountain View over the past day or two. So it's 9 a.m. here, and I can see quite a few tired faces in front of me, so I thought I'd start with a quiz. So the first question I've got, in what Android version did theme.hollow appear? Right, so Android declare, hands up. Honeycomb. Hey, too clever. That's an easy one. How about the dark action bar variant? Honeycomb. Honeycomb 3.2. A few. ICS. A third one. How did selectableltemBackground change in Kitkat? Did it change to a ripple? One. No, I changed to monochrome. I pressed the wrong button then. Don't worry, I got a fourth. In what version can you use Android foreground on a view? Is it Android 1.0? Oh, we've got a few. ICS? A few again. How about Marshmallow? So this is my trick question. So you can actually use foreground on frame layout from API 1, but we only actually moved it up to view on Marshmallow, so that's why it's trick. Anyway, hope you're awake now. So this talk is all about themes and styles, and we've realized recently that there aren't that many people who know it. It's quite a dense topic, and there's lots of little intricacies into it all. So we thought we'd write this talk to try and give everyone like a level playing field. So before we actually go into like the guts of it all, I thought we'd sort of take a quick refresher course and see what they actually are. So technically, themes and styles are exactly the same thing. Internally, they're both declared using the style tag. So in your resources, you create your styles. And you'll notice that when you actually create a theme, you're still using the style tag. The only difference between them is how you use them in your application. And we'll talk about more about that later. So at their simplest, styles and themes, because they're the same thing, are just key value stores. So here we've got a very, very simple style, and you'll notice that the actual key is the attribute, so Android background in this instance, and then the value is color blue. So we've just mentioned the word attributes there, and they're the kind of key to what themes and styles are all about. Now let's take a quick look at what they actually are and how they work. So as we mentioned, attributes are just keys. They're declared in the Android framework and also in your apps. The important thing to know, though, is that, yes, they are keys, but they also declare what type that can be set against them. And that's important because it affects how the data is stored. So when the attribute is read internally, it can affect how the actual value is read. And it also affects things like type conversion. So the system can actually convert between types for you. And because of that, we can do some XML linting based on this. So if you're using an attribute with a wrong type of value, we can put that into lint, and we can sort of flag it to you and make sure you're not going to shoot yourself in the foot. So these are the types of attributes that you can, format types that you can put on attributes. The ones on the left are all resource types. So they directly map to a resource type that you can set in your resources. So things like fraction, float, string, blah, blah. The ones on the right are special in that they are only used for attributes. Flag is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bit all. So you can have multiple flags bit ordered against each other. And then the second is enum, which is exactly what it is. It's an enumeration of ints. So you're going to get one value back. And then you've got the last one, which is reference. And that's kind of a catch-all for everything else. So Drawable uses this, because we don't have a drawable type. But basically, it just points to another resource. It points to a resource ID. So how you actually declare attributes is like this, using the Attr tag. Again, in your resources, so everyone's quite inside each other. And here you can see that there are two things you need to set. The first is the name. So this is the actual declaration for Android background using the framework. So it has a name of background, and then it declares its type, its format. It can accept two types, reference and color. Reference because it expects a drawable. And color, because as we said earlier, it can do type conversion. So what will happen is it can accept a color, like an int value, and then the system will automatically change that into a color drawable for you. So that's the type conversion we were talking about earlier. So all attributes provided by the framework are in the Android schema, which is why at the top of all of your layouts, you have to declare this namespace. Now, the actual the name for the namespace, in this case Android, which is in bold, is just a convention. You don't have to use this. You can name it whatever you want. But I'd advise you to keep using this, because it clearly sort of separates what are your attributes and what are Android's attributes. You can also declare custom attributes in your app. And indeed, you're probably already using libraries which declare their own attributes. Now, it's important to know that all attributes that are declared in your app, so even libraries, are in like a global namespace. Now, what that practically means is that if two libraries or basically, there are two declarations of the same attribute name in your app won't build because you'll get a conflict. So it's something to be careful about. Now, as I just mentioned, any attributes which are created in your app are in your app's namespace. So instead of declaring the Android namespace, you declare your app's one. Now, you do that via this syntax, and you insert your package name. Now, we know that's slightly clumsy to use, so the tools have a quick shortcut. So instead of actually putting the / your package name, you just do res auto, and it will do all the hard work for you. So we've just talked about what they are. Now let's talk about the differences and how you actually use them. So themes. Now, themes are tied to your context, which is why it takes two methods. It has two methods on the context, one called setTheme, which takes a resource ID pointing to a style. Now, there's one thing to note here. It's a kind of a badly named method in that it doesn't set, it applies. So you already have a theme on your activity, and then when you call this method, it'll apply it on top. It doesn't actually wipe anything out underneath. And then you have a getTheme, which will return an instance of the current theme. Now, you'll typically set themes in your Android manifest, so you'll set it in like the Android tag or whatever it is. Now, internally, all that does is just before your onCreate is called, it will call setTheme for you. So it's exactly the same APIs with the framework are calling. Now, themes don't actually really do anything. I like to think of them as like big configuration stores for everything else. So let's take a look at some of the things which are actually in there and how, what kind of configuration things are on. So the first thing is default widget styles. So when you create a widget in your layout, say edit text, it will have a default style applied to it. And the way it finds out what that default style is from your theme. Now, each different widget has a different attribute for its default style. Edit text is called edit text style. TextView is called TextView style. You get the idea. But yeah, so that's the default style. We have some color values. There are the ones you'll probably mostly use are for text colors. So it's text color primary, secondary, tertiary. Alan's going to talk more about these later, but there are others. Text appearance styles. So again, Alan's going to talk about text appearances, but they're basically mini styles which affect only text. Now, this is where I think the bulk of stuff is in themes, and that is window configuration values. So when your activity is created and your dialog, a window is created for you internally. And that is where your whole view hierarchy sits. And above that is a lot of framework stuff. So if you're using an action bar, it will inject a load of views for the action bar. And this is, so all the configuration values in your theme is how that affects it. So there's also stuff for like window transitions and all that kind of things. Then we have some drawables. Wouldn't it be nice if we provided some sort of off-the-shelf handy drawables to use? And we do. The most important, I think, is selectableltemBackground. That will give you a really nice drawable to use as a background for a view, like a clickable view, and it will like give you a highlight. So on a material and above, it will give you like a ripple. Before that, it's kind of like a state list. And then lastly is a section we call themeception. Alan's going to talk more about this later. But it's basically, there are certain components when created allow you to override their theme, and they'll pick it out from your master theme in your activity. Right, so that's themes out of the way. Let's talk about styles. Now, styles do a lot. They're the things that do the bulk of the work when styling your views. They're really handy for sort of decomposition of common styling, so you can reuse stuff across different views. So let's take a look at an example. So here we have a view, and we want to reuse this background tag. Now, this is kind of a trivial example because you're only reusing one thing. You wouldn't usually do this. You probably reuse 3 or 4, but it's a bit of a unwieldy example if we do more. So we're going to reuse this background tag. So here's our style for it. So we'll create a style, and then we'll give it we'll put an item in there pointing to the attribute, so the name, and then we'll put our value within it. Now, each attribute you set goes into the item tag. Then once we've done that, we can go back to our layout and swap the Android background and replace it with a style tag, pointing to the style. Now, if you've got more items in that style, they'll all be applied too. Bit of a pro tip for you, Android Studio does that whole flow for you in a really nice way. If you go to the Design tab when you're looking at a layout and right-click on a view, go Refactor Style, it gives you a nice little UI where you can like pull out attributes and put them into a style. It will do it all for you. But the other really good thing it does is that it will try and find other views in your layout and then automatically reuse the style. It's really cool. So hopefully now you know the difference between themes and styles. So let's have a look at sort of the intricacies of actually creating them. So one of the things that you can do with styles is that they support inheritance. Now, themes and styles can inherit from each other, which is handy for when you're creating sort of derivative styles, and you'll see examples in a minute. The important thing to know is that they overlay each other. There are a couple of ways of implementing inheritance in styles. The first is implicitly, using the dot notation. So the parent here would be widget.material.button. So it's the style before the preceding dot. You can also do it explicitly, and that's done through the parent tag. So here we've got a style called myButtonStyle, and it sets an explicit parent. And as you'd guess, the parent is what you've set. Now, there's a small gotcha in that the explicit way always wins over the implicit. So we've got style here, which is using both dot notation as in the name, but also has a parent tag. And the explicit version always wins. Now, the really powerful thing when using styles is that you can reference values from your theme. And that's that attribute thing we were talking about earlier. So here we go back to our style that we created, which sets a background to my drawable. And instead of using that, we want to use the selectableltemBackground, which we talked about earlier, which is that nice clickable highlight. So this is the syntax you use. So let's break that down a little bit because it looks a little bit alien. So let's break it down. First thing is the question mark. Now that denotes that we're going to be doing a theme lookup. The second bit, the Android colon, is the namespace we're going to be looking up. So the name of the namespace that the attribute is in. Yeah. So if you're using a custom attribute, you can put whatever attribute, whatever namespace you're set into. Then we have @/. Now that denotes the type of thing we're going to be looking up. Now in true Android fashion, we only have one type, which is @. So you can actually omit this, which we'll see in a minute. And then we have the last bit, which is the actual name of the attribute we're going to be looking up. Now, as I said, the type is optional, which is probably why you've seen this syntax. So the @ is omitted. It works the same. So now I'm going to hand over to Alan to go through theme.material.
Thanks, Chris. So Chris just gave you the technical side of what is a theme, what is a style, and how do we create them. So we're going to go hands-on with some of the material styles to learn what we have as a base building blocks for our own styles and how we can apply these in practice. All right, so first we have themes. Themes in Android are prefixed with theme dot. In material, it's theme.material. So everyone should be familiar with these. We've got the material dark theme. We have themes that have window attributes for dialogues. And of course, we have themes that do some special things like give you a dark action bar on top of a light theme. And if you look at the actual framework definitions of these, it's just a huge bag of attributes for colors, window attributes, things like that. We also have overlay themes. So these are themes that define a subset of values that, as Chris mentioned, get applied on top of your existing theme. So for example, material.light contains only the colors relevant for a light theme. It's not going to change any of your window attributes. For people who are developing for older platforms, you may have noticed on API 21 and 22 that if you set a color accent in your theme and then you open a dialog on API 21 and 22, you're still going to get teal unless you explicitly go and create a dialog theme that redefines your accent color. In API 23, we added a dialog overlay theme. This only redefines the window attributes specific to dialogues. It gets applied on top of your activity theme, so the host activity that creates the dialog. We apply window attributes on top of that, so your color accent, anything else you've set, gets propagated to dialogues in API 23 and above. Overlay themes look like this. again, it's just a subset of the things that would have been defined in the overall material light or dark or whatever themes. You can create these yourselves very easily, and then just use theme.applyStyle or setTheme in your activity. The material theme spec also defines a number of text appearances. So for larger text, you change the opacity a little bit. For buttons, you may set all caps. These are prefixed with text appearance in material text appearance.material. At the XML level, these are just sets of attributes specific to text. And these are either defined in your theme with text appearance small attribute, or you can apply them directly to a text view using the Android:text appearance attribute. So this is just going to apply a set of text attributes to style your text. We also have a number of default widget styles. So these are prefixed with widget.material. They're going to implement things that you'll recognize from the material spec. So for example, in API 24, Android N, we've added a seekbar.discrete, widget.material.seekbar.discrete, which is going to give you these little tick marks along each progress point in your seekbar. You can check out API demos for a longer example of some of the different variations that we have on widget styles. But these you can apply to your widgets with the style attribute. So style equals seekbar.discrete will give you these dots. And these are just sets of attributes that are going to provide defaults for your views. So for example, the seekbar discrete has implicit inheritance from the material seekbar, and we just redefine tick mark so that we get those drawables at each progress point. So while we're here, anybody who's really dug into the material theme may have noticed something unusual about our widget styles. And this is that the light themes and dark themes are identical. So our light themes typically just inherit directly from the default themes and don't redefine anything. But under different parent themes, so if your activity is light or dark, you're still going to get correctly colored widgets. How do we do that? Well, as Chris mentioned, we have colors defined by the themes. And we're going to use these in the widgets. So this allows really high-level styling of what things look like. Everybody should be familiar with color accent from material. This gives you a little pop of color that shows up in various places. For the background of button.color, the foreground of borderless colored buttons, radio buttons, etc. One example of how to implement this, so for the colored button that we just showed, we have a background that points to a drawable. In that drawable, which is just a ripple wrapping a rounded rect shape, we actually don't use PNGs anymore, we have a tint, and that tint points to a color state list. And that color state list has an enabled and a disabled state. The enabled state points to color accent. So when you see that colored button, the default color is going to be color accent tint on a white-shaped drawable wrapped with a ripple. So let's talk a little bit more about theme colors. We also have foreground and background colors. So these are going to be white and black, or black and white, respectively, for the light and dark themes. And what good does this actually do us? You may not be using flat black or flat white in your application a lot. Well, let's take the switch for an example. So the switch has a couple of different colors, and we could have defined theme attributes for switch foreground, switch background, and they're all basically just variations on white or black. So let's dig into the XML for this. The switch track is defined as a rounded rect shape. Again, we don't really use PNGs. And it points to a color state list for its tint. In the enabled state, this is going to be a dropped alpha. In the disabled state, this is going to inherit the disabled alpha from the theme, which varies based on light or dark theme, and it's going to use the foreground color. So in the dark theme, you have a dropped alpha version of white. This is applied on top of a rounded rect that already has a dropped opacity, so we're going to end up with everything being a slight variation on the foreground color. And you can very easily use this in your own widgets to get something that's going to be consistent with your theme. We also have text colors, as Chris mentioned. So we have a primary text color, which is used to provide very high contrast for things that the user needs to be looking at immediately. We have secondary text color, which is just a dropped opacity, and these are going to follow the material spec, so I believe 84 and 56% opacity. And they're going to follow the theme colors. We also have inverse versions of these, which we don't use so much on the platform anymore, but if you're going to be displaying content against, say, your accent color, text primary inverse or secondary inverse is a great way to do that. We also have color accent primary and primary dark, which we added in material and are going to provide your branding colors. So if you're pulling in color accent, you get that color pop. You'll probably want to use a white or use color primary inverse on top of that. So in a light theme, you'll have a dark accent. In a dark theme, you'll have a light accent. And you can pull these into your drawables and your color state lists. We also have color control normal and activated. Control normal is great, and I really recommend everybody use this if you have icons. So for example, checkboxes are going to use color control normal by default. If you're pulling an icon into your action bar and you tint it with color control normal, it's going to be the exact right opacity. And the number of times that I've seen applications where the toolbar icons are different by like 5% alpha, it kills me every time. So please use color control normal for your icons. So looking at an example from API demos, you can probably guess how a lot of these widgets are set up. So we have compound buttons, which is text color primary. We have that switch text right below it, which is text color secondary. We have the accent color in the activated state for our checkboxes and radio buttons. And we have the color background as our overall background, color background floating as our card background. So you can look at a screenshot of something or look at an application and probably guess where a lot of the colors are coming from. All right, so now we have an overview of what's available to us and how these are used to build the framework themes and styles and how we can apply these to our applications. And these are very powerful tools in Android, and theme attributes are especially powerful starting in API 21. So starting in API 21, you can use color state lists and theme attributes to tint your drawables. So you can specify color control highlight for your ripple, which is what we have as the default. And you can specify a color state list as a tint or as a color for XML-defined shapes. So if you'd like to step away from using PNGs all the time, maybe you have a bunch of different PNGs for different colors of states, you can just directly put a color state list in, and when you press a button, you'll get a different color. Color state lists support theme attributes starting in the next API version, 22. And this means that you can start pulling in the foreground color, the accent color, setting the alpha to match the theme in your color state lists, which is going to, again, help you step away from having drawable selectors or individual PNGs for all of your assets. AppCompat also supports color state lists. Starting in version 24, you can use AppCompat resources, which is going to provide an alternate inflation path that can read theme attributes from your color state list XML. It does this automatically internally, and you can do this at runtime for specific XML files. We also support view tinting. So what this means is for views that own drawable assets, things like the thumb in a switch, the track in a progress bar, you can tint these either from layout XML or at runtime using some accessor methods. So for example, switch has a thumb and a track, and because it's a view, it also has a background. All of these have separate XML attributes that you can use to set a tint. These can take theme attributes. These can take color state lists. In API 22, they can take color state lists of theme attributes. And this is a really powerful way to tint just a one-off somewhere within your layout. So you need this switch to be red. You can make it red really easily. You need it red with a disabled state. You can set a color state list. As I mentioned, we have a bunch of text appearances in the material style. These are just bags of text attributes. So you can apply these to your text views using Android text appearance. And you can reapply these at runtime, which is actually something kind of unusual for Android styles. So for most views, styles get applied once at inflation time. For text views, you can restyle them at runtime whenever you need to using setTextAppearance, which takes a style which should be a text appearance or something that inherits from a text appearance. It just defines a set of text attributes. All right, so we've learned some cool things about what's available to us for creating styles and creating themed drawables. How can we apply this to do something kind of cool? Well, we introduced the day-night theme in the support library, and this is something that we've supported in the platform for actually quite a long time. So day-night is implemented as a resource qualifier. This has existed since API 8. Starting in API 23, this is something that any application can toggle through UI Mode Manager. So if you write an application and you want to toggle the global state of day-night mode, you just go into UI Mode Manager and you can set night mode. When that changes, it's going to be treated as a configuration change, like you would have for changing device orientation, which adds the landscape resource qualifier. So this is going to really simplify swapping light and dark resources if your user either prefers dark or if you want to set it up for automatic, where at nighttime maybe your user will see a dark theme and daytime they'll see a light theme. So the actual implementation of this relies on inheritance. So we specify a day-night theme, and we have the same name in both our values and night-qualified values directories. And the only difference is the parent that we're inheriting from. So under not night or the default qualifier, we're going to inherit from theme.material light. And under the night qualifier, we're going to inherit from the dark material theme. Now the magic here is that when we have this resource qualifier change, the application is going to go through a lifecycle event. We'll get an on-configuration change. And we're going to reload our theme using this new parent, which means everything that we inflate is going to have different theme colors. Now, you can also define explicit colors. So if you want to have a hard-coded color and define that differently under night or not night, you can do that. But it's easier to rely on theme colors. So the end result of this is that because everything gets inflated against your theme and we're using a different parent, you're going to get either dark or light resources. And in custom widgets that you've made where you're using theme attributes, you're just going to automatically get the right colors. So you don't have to do a lot of work to switch between implementing a light and a dark theme. As Chris demonstrated in our What's New in Support library talk yesterday, this has been backported to API 14 through AppCompat. So if you want to implement a light and dark theme support in your application, super easy. Most of the work is already done for you. You just need to add a little switch that will toggle night mode. All right, so using themes and attributes can help simplify switching the visual presentation of your application. But what if you want to change just a small portion of presentation in your application? So we know that theme.material can make your application look dark. We know that theme.material light can make your application look light. But what if you want to have something like a dark action bar, but the rest of your application be light? Well, there's one way you could do this. You could use the light activity light theme and then just specify everything in your action bar manually to be dark. That's a little complicated, so maybe instead we'll have a dark theme and we'll just manually specify everything in our activity, all of our content, to be a different color. That ends up being really, really tricky, so please don't do that. Don't hard code text colors. So there's an easier way, and that is through overlay themes and specifying themes on portions of your view hierarchy. And this is what we do with the dark action bar theme. So we actually redefine the theme that's used for the toolbar section of your application. So everybody recalls we have overlay themes. We have a light theme that pulls in light colors. We have dark theme that pulls in dark colors. And these are implemented using the Android theme attribute from XML. So this gets picked up by the layout inflator, and it's going to replace or overlay the theme used to inflate a subsection of your view hierarchy. And the actual implementation here is pulling the theme attribute from your XML and then applying that as a context theme wrapper, which is exactly what it sounds like. We take your inflation context, and we're going to apply a theme on top of that. we're then going to inflate all of the child content against this new wrapped context. So what you will get is, effectively, the dark theme in the section of layout that has Android theme equals dark, and light everywhere else. Now, the actual implementation of this relies on the default layout that we provide for an activity that has an action bar. So if you dig into some of the XML files in the Android framework, screen action bar is what we inflate if you've requested an action bar in your activity. And we're going to set the Android theme attribute to inherit from the action bar theme attribute defined in your theme, which has attribute and theme a lot of times, which is why we call this themeception. So we're going to pull in the dark theme on top of the light activity theme. We've defined action bar theme in the dark action bar theme as material.dark.actionbar. This is the dark overlay, which pulls in the dark theme colors. It switches the text foreground and background colors. An action bar sets up a couple of special things for displaying the, let's see, accent color in your toolbar. But the important part is that we're pulling in dark colors on top of your base light theme. We also redefined the pop-up theme so that you get a light pop-up on top of a dark action bar on top of a light activity. So we have 3 themes at work here, all overlaid on top of one another. We also support Android.theme through the app-compat library. So this is going to work all the way back to API 7 for XML that gets inflated through app-compat. And inheritance of the parent theme is going to work on API 11 and above. And what this means is that if you put Android :theme in your XML, on API 7, we will apply it to that view only. On API 11 and above, we will apply it to all of the views that are inflated as a child of that view. Right, now Chris is going to cover some common mistakes that developers make when using themes and styles.
Thanks, Alan. So as Alan said, we're now going to go through some of the things we see quite a lot, both in Google Apps and also externally on things like Stack Overflow. Now, hopefully, I'll be able to stop repeating myself, because we see this a lot, and we always say the same thing. So the first thing we're going to go through is using the incorrect style parent. So it's easier if we go through an example and show you what this can actually do. So here we have an edit text. Well, we have multiple edit text. And what we want to do, we want to make every edit text have a different font, the medium font, but it could be anything. So what we're going to do, we're going to change the default style for edit text, and then set it to have a medium font. So here we have the example, and here's our style. So our style here is my edit text view style, could be whatever you want, but it sets one thing, which is font family, and that sets it to medium. Now, once you've done that, we'll then reference it in our theme, so it gets picked up as default. And then you run your app, and you see this. Suddenly, all of your edit texts have gone. You've lost all of your styling. They're no longer editable. But you have changed the font to medium. Now, the reason why this happened is that you didn't set a parent on the style. And what that happens is that you no longer pick up all of these system defaults. So you no longer get the background, the fact that it's editable, all sorts of weird and random things which are in the style. So the way to fix it is you just set the correct parent. Now, the best way of finding out what the parent is just look at the theme you're inheriting from. So if you're using theme.material, just go into it. It is big. It's about, I don't know, 200 lines-ish. But it's all quite nicely spaced out. They're all grouped together. It's not too hard to read. And suddenly, once you fixed it, it all looks good again. Now, this is quite a technical mistake. You're only really going to mistake this if you're kind of writing custom views. But it's the difference between defStyleAttr and defStyleRes. Now, there are 2 places where you'll use this. The first is the for-arg constructor on view. Now, that was added in API 21, so I doubt many of you are using it. But the main place you're going to use this is in obtain styled attributes. And that is the way you actually read attributes in views. So here you can see at the bottom, the last 2 parameters are defStyleAttr and defStyleRes. And the problem is that defStyleAttr should always point to an attr. So the defStyleAttr should point to an attribute in your theme to pick the default style from. Now, the last one, defStyleRes, should point to an actual resource, so an actual style resource. In this point, r.style.widget, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you mix them up, basically things stop working. Now, following on from that, there's some intricacies in how obtain styled attributes actually works. And it's to do with the order preference of how it reads an attribute. So when you're trying to read a set of attributes, this is the order it goes through. So the first thing it looks for is the value in your attribute set. Now that attribute set is what contains all the attributes which are set on your actual layout. So if you have a layout and you've set Android background on it, it will be contained in the attribute set. The second thing it looks for is the same value within any explicit style. So if you're using a style tag pointing to a style, it will then look for it in there. The third thing it looks for is in the defStyleRes. So that's in the actual concrete pointer to a default style. Lastly, it looks at the attribute, the default style in your theme. And then finally, it looks at the base value in the theme. Now, please don't rely on this, because it leads on to the next mistake, which is using view attributes in themes. So this is a mistake which actually someone on our team made recently. So here we have a theme, and we've set the Android background tag on it. Now, Android background is something you usually use in a view, but here it's set in the theme. Now, going back to the obtain style attributes bit, the last thing it looks for is in the base value of the theme, which basically means that because you've set that in your theme, any view which doesn't have a background set in it will then use this value, which basically means if you set a background in your theme, say it's I don't know, color pink, every view which doesn't have an explicit background will have this pink background, and that's a really big mistake which we see quite often. Now, we are actually going to write more of these mistakes up into like a blog post, so follow us on social and we'll post them up. All right, that's it. Hopefully you've learned some stuff about themes and styles. Thank you very much.